My work and these installations aren't literally landscapes, but they consider the landscape and primarily the natural forces that alter it over thousands of years, generally slowly, sometimes cataclysmically. I like the combination of fabricated steel and powdered clay. The steel is rigid and stable, and the geometric forms all are in contrast to the powdered clay, which is very, very ephemeral, impermanent. I think that could be perhaps suggestive of the conflict between the natural world and contemporary civilization. That may be a stretch, but I think there's a link. Well, it's interesting. When we moved to Ohio, I think I was still carrying, images of the landscape from the West in my mind. One of the things that struck me when we moved here was the Indian mound culture, the Hopewell culture that left the Indian mounds in Ohio. And it prompted a series of drawings, primarily. And I was working on drawings that got more and more complicated, which essentially showed mound forms being cut into sections and moved apart. And I was having trouble, quite frankly, with the drawing, with the perspective of these kind of complicated, increasingly complicated forms. So I went down to the creek that runs along our property and dug clay out of the bank. The clay was impure, had rocks in it and so forth. Took it back to the studio, which at the time was in an old barn, and I modeled these clay forms of mound shapes, cut them apart, and then drew them and did drawings and prints. And it sort of got me to thinking at the time it would be more interesting and I could make more complicated shapes and forms if I used a dry powdered material. So I used flour, cornstarch, plaster, and eventually started working with dry clay that ceramists generally mix with water and form it into, plastic forms. Well, anyway, I was taking the dry clay and modeling these mound forms on glass slabs. So I was doing this actually through the early mid-70s and then making drawings and prints based on those forms that I would model on the glass slabs. And it wasn't until, later, probably 5 or 10 years later, that I started making sculpture, combining the clay with aluminum and with steel. And I exhibited a few of those, but I was primarily making that work, making that sculpture to make drawings and prints from. And then increasingly became more and more interested in the sculpture as sculpture. And the exhibition of the work took on more and more of an installation. obviously, people, when they look at my work, I think are going to, I would think they would connect it to the landscape, but it definitely goes beyond landscape and is suggestive of things that happen to the Earth, sometimes, very slowly over thousands of years, sometimes dramatically, cataclysmically. I hope viewers will come away with some of that, but in the final analysis, I think, like most artists, I want my work to be seen as something beautiful.